Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're immersing ourselves in a case that is really a masterclass in modern forensics. It's this chilling intersection of digital detection and just good old-fashioned investigative grit.
That's absolutely right. We're going to reconstruct the final tragic hours of a 19-year-old named Dylan Rounds. We'll be focusing on how this, seemingly unremarkable young man's routine was just so violently interrupted.
And how investigators used his digital footprint, the data he didn't even know he was creating, to expose a killer. A killer who was hiding in plain sight, disguised as a trusted family friend.
It's a terrifying thought. So our mission today is to really understand how investigators took what you might call low-tech physical evidence.
Right, like a muddy boot, a stained rag.
Yeah.
Things you'd find at any crime scene.
Exactly. And they meticulously synthesized that with this high-tech, unseen world of GPS metadata. And in doing so, they proved that a very specific, very calculated timeline of lies was, well, it was nothing more than digital fiction.
We're looking at a case where the killer thought he was completely invisible. But, the device in his own pocket, it betrayed his every single movement.
So let's start at the beginning. The scene is this remote, expansive farmland in Box Elder County, Utah. The date is May 28th, 2022.
And Dylan Rounds, as you said, only 19. From everything we know, a really independent, hardworking young guy, totally dedicated to getting his farm off the ground.
And that day started like countless others. It started with a routine check-in.
And it's always those routines, isn't it? When they get disrupted, that's when you get that immediate sense of alarm.
It is. Dylan called his grandmother at 6:51 a.m. His plan was super practical. It was mundane. It had been raining, so he told her he needed to secure his seed truck.
Okay, so just dropping it off in a shed nearby.
Just dropping it in a shed to keep it out of the mud. After that, he was simply going to walk the 5 miles back to his main farm property. It was a familiar trip for him.
A familiar, a pretty lengthy chore.
Mm-hmm.
But nothing out of the ordinary.
Nothing at all. But when 2 days passed without any contact, his family just knew. They knew something was terribly, terribly wrong. Dylan wasn't the kind of person to just vanish.
So the search begins. When officers arrive at that shed where the truck was supposed to be parked, the whole atmosphere must have shifted, right?
Right.
From a missing person search to something much darker.
Immediately, you could feel it shift because right away, they found things that didn't add up.
Let's focus on those initial findings because they were secured on the spot and they really became the foundation for the whole case. What did the officers find right there, next to the truck?
They found 2 very specific items that, to an investigator, scream that a struggle or some kind of violent incident took place right there. First, a stained rag towel.
Right.
And second, and this is much more forensically significant, a lightly stained pair of Georgia work boots.
Wait, his work boots? The ones he would have been wearing?
His work boots. And crucially, they were found near the truck. Not inside it, not placed neatly somewhere. They were just there, suggesting they were removed or, shed in a hurry, maybe during a struggle.
And the investigators would have known right away what that meant. Securing those items was priority number 1.
Oh, absolutely. They knew instinctively that finding Dylan's work boots, the very boots he would have needed to walk 5 miles home abandoned, with potential stains on them right next to the truck. It completely contradicted the idea that he just set off on his walk.
It suggested his plan came to a very abrupt, very violent halt.
Exactly. So they secured those items immediately, recognizing their potential as primary crime scene evidence without even knowing at that point who they should be looking for.
And here's where the story takes that really sickening turn. This is where the betrayal narrative truly begins. Because as the investigation kicks off, the officers, and more importantly, Dylan's grieving family, they're being assisted by someone.
Someone who seemed genuinely concerned. A man named James Brenner, age 61.
And Brenner wasn't just some neighbor. What was his connection to the family?
He was an intimate figure in their lives. He was a close family friend of Dylan's grandparents, deeply integrated into the fabric of their community and the farm operation. He was around all the time.
So when Dylan goes missing, Brenner is right there.
He's right there. He was active. He was present. He was seemingly eager to help with the search efforts. He was offering up theories, checking locations, standing shoulder to shoulder with the people whose lives he had just shattered.
It's the ultimate psychological mask. He knew exactly what had happened, yet he's participating in this public performance of grief and concern. What does that tell you about a person's capacity for calculated deception?
It speaks to an almost I mean, a clinical level of detachment. His eagerness wasn't helpful. It was completely performative. He was trying to cement his role as an innocent, invested party
He's literally watching the family search for a body.
that he himself had already disposed of, yeah. And this unsettling fact that he actively participated in the search immediately marked him, at least in retrospect, as someone capable of maintaining a convincing facade under the most extreme pressure.
So, as you, the listener, follow this deep dive, just remember that central conflict, the meticulous truth revealed by science versus the elaborate web of lies woven by a supposed friend. We are going to show you exactly how those initial findings, that stained boot and the truck's location, were painstakingly synthesized with digital evidence to build an inescapable case.
To understand why the focus turned to Brenner so quickly, you really have to look at the geography of the area. The physical layout is crucial here.
The shared space.
The shared space. Dylan dropped his seed truck off in a shed, and that shed was located just yards away from where James Brenner lived in his motorhome.
Proximity makes you a witness, and in a crime, it automatically makes you a person of interest. I mean, given that Dylan was confirmed to be at that shed that morning, Brenner had to be the last likely person to have seen him alive.
Precisely. But when he was questioned, Brenner launched into this immediate, very calculated denial. His first response was just a blanket refusal. He denied seeing Dylan, and he denied seeing the truck arrive that morning at all. He tried to paint himself as being elsewhere, maybe asleep.
And he had an alibi ready to go, an incredibly detailed one for the afternoon, designed to place him far away from the crime scene during what would have been the critical window for disposing of evidence.
He was very precise. He stated that he left his own property between 1:30 p.m. and 2 p.m. He claimed he drove to his friend Donald Hatley's place, where he stayed for several hours, until about 9 p.m.
It's a 7-hour window.
A 7-hour window. He claimed he only noticed the truck parked there when he finally returned home late that evening. He was trying to create this airtight alibi where he was demonstrably not on the land.
But here's the really fascinating psychological component. Brenner didn't just deny being involved. He immediately started deflecting. He started planting a motive on Dylan himself.
This is a classic move of psychological manipulation. He used the conversation as an opportunity to denigrate the victim, to establish this narrative that Dylan was difficult, entitled, and, disrespectful. He complained bitterly that Dylan was selfish.
And he tied it directly to the truck, right?
Yeah.
To the act of parking the truck.
He did. He highlighted that the parking of the truck, the single most mundane act that put Dylan in that location in the first place, had caused him significant personal inconvenience.
What was his specific complaint? I mean, was it really just about a seed truck taking up some space?
It was much more specific than that, and it shows this deep-seated possessiveness that would later become a huge red flag. He complained that Dylan had parked the truck without giving him any notice,
Okay.
and that this forced him to move his chicken coop building materials out of the way, and that in the process, a horse panel had been knocked out. So, to a normal person, this is an annoyance, right?
A minor inconvenience.
To Brenner, it was a profound act of territorial disrespect. He framed it almost as if Dylan had committed this major affront, an offense that was worthy of being taught a lesson.
And that leads directly to this chilling remark he made, while Dylan was still officially just a missing person. It's an incredibly damning statement that immediately put him on the investigators' radar.
It revealed his whole mindset. It was punitive, it was vengeful. When he was discussing Dylan's perceived flaws, his supposed lack of discipline, Brenner looked at the investigators and said, quite clearly, I agree with them 100% Dylan's lack of discipline. They only need to be taught a lesson.
Wow. To say that about a missing 19-year-old?
Imagine hearing that from a supposed family friend who is standing right beside the grieving grandparents. The investigators immediately understood they were dealing with someone who not only harbored this deep resentment, but saw himself as some kind of agent of discipline, an agent of punishment.
It transforms the parking problem from a small issue into a catalyst. A justification, almost, for retribution. That statement is the first major psychological clue that this was not a random act.
And that psychological flag was soon backed up by hard documentation. The investigators, now highly focused on Brenner, started digging into his background. And they discovered something significant, something that entirely redefined their perception of him.
This is where the investigation took a really sharp turn, because they found out that James Brenner had an active, current arrest warrant.
An active warrant for aggravated assault in a totally unrelated case. This wasn't some 20-year-old conviction that he'd put behind him. This was a sign of recent, unchecked rage.
And the details of that warrant were pretty brutal.
They were shocking. He was wanted for repeatedly hitting another man with a chair multiple times. So this wasn't just a push or a threat. This was a documented capacity for extreme, sustained physical violence. When the officers learned this, that whole helpful family friend narrative just shattered.
Suddenly, they're dealing with a known violent felon who is operating under this facade of normalcy.
And his behavior, when they arrested him on that warrant, provided even more insight into his rigid psychological state. What the officers observed when they moved in to take him into custody was very telling.
His priorities were all wrong, weren't they?
Completely displaced. Instead of asking about Dylan or cooperating with this very serious charge, his focus was absolute possessiveness over his space. He was visibly angry, extremely upset, insisting that no one enter his motorhome.
And there's that strange detail about the gate.
Yes, most bizarrely, he was demanding that the gate to his property must remain locked because he was afraid his horse might escape.
So you have a man facing an aggravated assault charge who's also the prime suspect in a missing persons case that's looking more and more like a homicide, and he's prioritizing a fence and a horse over his legal standing or cooperating. That is a massive behavioral red flag.
It's a huge psychological indicator. It showed the detectives just how central control over that physical space was to Brenner's entire identity, his land, his rules, and this immediate possessiveness. It just reinforced the idea that the seemingly minor provocation of Dylan parking the truck improperly, a territorial infringement, could be enough to trigger that documented temper.
The same temper that led to the chair assault.
Exactly. And that possessiveness, it fed directly into this deeper grievance he had about Dylan, which he openly discussed during questioning. It went way beyond just the parking. It was a deep-seated feeling that he was being disrespected by a young man he considered inferior.
He really laid it all out for them, didn't he?
He laid out a comprehensive picture of his contempt. He called Dylan a spoiled little brat. He complained about Dylan's lack of discipline, citing instances where Dylan's grandfather would cover for his perceived failures, like writing a $300 check for farm expenses.
He even tried to paint Dylan as being rude to his own family.
He did. He alleged that Dylan would yell at his own grandfather. So in Brenner's mind, Dylan was entitled, ungrateful, and basically needed to be humbled.
The work situation seemed to be the real sticking point, though. The final straw for all this long-term resentment. He didn't just dislike Dylan, he felt genuinely misused by him as an employer.
Oh, that resentment was clear and visceral. Brenner and his friend Donald Hatley had both recently quit working for Dylan. Brenner felt Dylan was completely unreliable.
Did he give any specific examples?
He brought up an example of Dylan allegedly going to a town called Burley 3 times in 3 days without telling them, just leaving them waiting and unable to work. He felt Dylan expected them to work miracles without providing basic respect or communication, and crucially, without paying them what they were worth.
And he brought Hadley into it, describing the moment they both quit.
Yes, he described this definitive moment of disrespect. He said Dylan returned to the property, drove right past them without even acknowledging them, and then started working on something totally trivial, a washing machine, instead of addressing the work they were there to do.
So he's building a case for the investigators.
He's trying to. He reported that Hatley, in frustration, threw Dylan's tools back at him and quit right then and there. This whole narrative, as told by Brenner, was intended to show the investigators that everyone agreed Dylan was disrespectful and difficult.
So if we step back and look at this analytically, what does this tell us about the mechanism of the crime? We have a history of aggravated assault, this deep-seated resentment over perceived disrespect, and a high value placed on territorial control.
What's fascinating here is that the crime wasn't random, it was instrumental, even if the timing was spontaneous. The minor provocation, parking the truck, and disturbing the chicken coop materials, it triggered a violent response in someone who was already boiling over with grievance and who possessed a documented capacity for physical rage.
So the parking incident wasn't the motive for the murder.
It was the trigger. It was the trigger that allowed his suppressed, violent behavior to finally manifest. You can see a clear escalation curve here. From perceived disrespect, to the documented rage of the chair assault, to the final lethal act against Dylan. This wasn't uncharacteristic at all. This was a predictable, if tragic, endpoint for a pattern of unresolved aggression.
The psychological profile was compelling, but investigators needed more. They needed concrete physical proof to turn that suspicion into certainty. And that proof came directly from those first pieces of evidence they found. the boots.
The forensic finding from the crime lab was definitive and really unavoidable for Brenner. They found touch DNA matching James Brenner on Dylan's blood-stained Georgia work boots.
Let's break that down. Touch DNA. That's just the residual DNA left behind from handling an object, right?
Simply by handling it. So finding his DNA on a blood-stained piece of clothing found right near the crime scene, especially when his story was that he never saw Dylan that morning. It was a catastrophic contradiction.
Now wait, let me push back on that for a second. Couldn't he have genuinely just picked up a boot at some other time, maybe days earlier, and tossed it aside? How certain could they be that that DNA transfer was related to the crime itself?
That's the exact question a defense attorney would ask, and it's what the investigators are ready for. And Brenner did try to minimize it. When they confronted him, he admitted that, yeah, maybe he picked up a boot one day and threw it while he was checking on his horse.
So an innocent incidental transfer.
That's what he was selling. But the blood on the boot itself made that explanation nearly impossible to swallow. The fact that the boots were so clearly associated with the immediate violent disruption of Dylan's morning, found with blood on them, meant that Brenner's DNA had to have been transferred during that critical period. He had to have handled the boots either during or immediately after Dylan was injured.
And his reaction to this, being unfazed and dismissive, it just speaks volumes. But his actions right after those initial police interviews are maybe even more telling about his guilt.
This is a classic example of what law enforcement calls consciousness of guilt. Immediately after returning home from talking to the police, he must have recognized they were focusing on him. Brenner took this highly suspicious action regarding his firearms.
What exactly did he do with the weapons?
He quickly handed 2 rifles and, very crucially, a revolver pistol to Donald Hatley for safekeeping. He tried to justify it, of course.
What was his excuse?
He said he felt he was the low fruit on the tree and expected the police to target him. He even claimed he could legally own the guns, which was a lie. Given the circumstances and the fact that he was actually a felon prohibited from possessing firearms, the action spoke for itself. He was trying to get rid of potential evidence.
Including what was very likely the murder weapon.
Including the weapon that was likely used in the crime. Now let's pivot to Donald Hatley's perspective, the friend who provided that alibi.
Right. Hatley confirmed Brenner's timeline. James arrived around 3 p.m., stayed until 9 p.m., and they ate ribs. So the timeline itself is solid.
It is. But Hatley's reflection on that afternoon after the fact gives us this terrifying look into Brenner's psychological state immediately after the murder.
It's a case of profound psychological dissonance for him, isn't it?
Completely. He confirms the afternoon was totally normal. They ate ribs, they chatted, they just acted like 2 friends catching up. It was only later, when the evidence came out confirming Brenner's guilt, that Hatley was deeply disturbed by it. He admitted that he ran that entire evening over and over in his head, looking for a sign, a slip, a moment of stress, any tell, but he found nothing.
How did Hatley describe that sense of shock? What did he say?
He was just astonished by Brenner's sheer coldness. Hatley reflected that he gets nervous just shooting a deer, yet Brenner had just committed a brutal murder and could sit down hours later perfectly calm and eat a plate of ribs.
He realized he'd been sitting across from a sociopath.
He realized he was sitting with someone capable of maintaining absolute composure while harboring the darkest secret imaginable. So that confirmed alibi. Ironically, it just helped the investigators. It focused them on the precise morning hours, the time Brenner was supposed to be asleep or gone, because the murder and the subsequent cleanup had to have been completed before 3 p.m.
So if the boots gave investigators the physical link, the phone data gave them the timeline and the location. This is where the case becomes absolutely inescapable.
It was a very proactive move by the detectives. They obtained a search warrant for James Brenner's phone well before the final confrontation. This allowed them to set a trap, essentially.
A preemptive strike. They knew his true movements before they ever gave him the chance to tell his story.
Exactly. He was unknowingly walking into an interview where the investigators already held the map to his deception.
So let's compare his stated timeline against the digital facts, because the discrepancies are immediate and they are just damning.
His lie was that he left the property between 1:30 p.m. and 2 p.m. But the phone forensics, and we're talking detailed GPS metadata here, not just broad cell tower pings, prove that James's phone was active and moving around his property from 7 a.m. onward.
For the entire morning.
The entire morning. And crucially, it remained on the property, moving around, until 2437 p.m. He had lied about his presence for more than 7 hours.
And the data didn't just prove he was there, it pointed them to a new, critical location that had been completely overlooked in the search efforts up to that point.
Absolutely. The GPS route showed James's phone traveled directly from the barn area to a previously unsearched spot known as the Lucin Pond. The movement began at 2:37 p.m., and his phone arrived at the pond location at 2:44 p.m.
And this trip happened just minutes before he arrived at Hatley's house to establish his alibi.
Tight, fast, and with a clear purpose. And that suspicious travel route led to the digital smoking gun. The search team focused on that exact pond location.
And they found Dylan's phone.
They found Dylan's phone. It was recovered submerged inside a water pipe near the Lucin Pond, exactly where James's phone had tracked to. Now, the killer's motive was clearly to destroy the evidence, but modern forensic recovery techniques allowed investigators to access the phone's internal data even after it had been submerged for 21 days.
Okay, let's break down the synchronized timelines. This is the moment the case against Brenner shifts from strong circumstantial evidence to irrefutable proof. The data from Dylan's phone had to line up perfectly with James's phone.
We have to look at this in a few parts. Part 1. We know Dylan was at the barn property from 6:49 a.m. up until 7:36 a.m. He's moving around, securing the truck. He was back by 8:30 a.m. Then comes the most critical moment of the timeline, 11:01 a.m.
What is the forensic significance of 11:01 a.m.?
At that exact moment, Dylan's phone went completely stationary on the property. It remained static, no movement, no data changes consistent with being carried for 3 hours and 36 minutes.
Which indicates...
It indicates the most probable time of the attack and his subsequent incapacitation or death. His phone was either dropped or placed somewhere static, right there on the property.
So for almost 4 hours, Dylan's phone is silent and static, while James's phone is active and moving around the immediate area doing, well, whatever he was doing.
Yeah.
Cleaning up.
Correct. James is on the property preparing. Then we hit the simultaneous event. At 2:37 p.m., we see a catastrophic convergence of the data. Dylan's phone, the static phone, and James's phone, the mobile phone, both register movement at the exact same time.
They start moving together.
They travel together following the exact same GPS path from the barn area to the Lucin Pond, arriving at 2:52 p.m.
That synchronicity is his undoing. It proves, without a shadow of a doubt, that James was physically carrying Dylan's phone, intending to dispose of it. It proves his denial of any contact was a complete and utter falsehood.
It's the digital map of the crime. Think of it like watching two separate dots on a tracking screen. Dot A, James, moves continuously. Dot B, Dylan, is static for hours. Then, dot A picks up dot B, and they move together, following the same route to the same dumping location, right before dot A goes to establish his physical alibi at Hatley's house.
And Brenner, a guy who claimed he didn't even understand technology, never knew his phone was recording his every step.
He never knew. His lie was absolutely demolished by GPS metadata. It's the moment technology provides the irrefutable truth against human deception.
With his synchronized phone data, the blood on the boots, and his aggressive history, the investigators finally had everything they needed. They brought James in for one last interrogation.
And they used a very deliberate, phased psychological strategy to try and extract a confession.
They started with what's often called the good guy who snapped strategy. How does that technique work in practice?
Well, the goal is to provide the suspect with a moral out, an external reason for the heinous act. It prevents them from having to admit they are a cold, premeditated killer.
So the detective starts with a soft touch.
A very soft touch. The lone detective who started the interview used a sympathetic tone. He appealed directly to James's self-perception, arguing that the crime was uncharacteristic, an emotional explosion, or not planned.
He was essentially offering James a defense, suggesting that Dylan, who he himself had described as provoking, must have pushed him too far.
Precisely. The detective said something along the lines of, "I don't think you are some bad guy that goes out and hurts people. I think something just happened, something instantaneous, something that Dylan provoked." The idea was to minimize the moral culpability, confess to manslaughter, and avoid the reputation of being an evil monster.
But the calculated deceiver we've been talking about, he rejected that easy path. He just doubled down on his absolute denial.
He was completely unwavering. He called the whole investigation a setup, insisting that nothing happened and that he was innocent. He was so confident in his ability to lie that he completely rejected the emotional off-ramp the detective offered him.
Which meant the investigators had to shift tactics entirely.
They did. Describe the physical and psychological atmosphere when two additional detectives walked into that room. That shift in power must have been intense.
It was a deliberate power play, designed to completely overwhelm him. The atmosphere changed from sympathetic inquiry to cold, hard confrontation. The two new detectives used more aggressive body language. They were stern, factual, no longer offering any comfort. They immediately introduced the element of fear and inevitability.
And what were the two critical pieces of information they dropped to induce that panic?
First, they eliminated his assumption of success. They revealed that they had found Dylan's phone. He must have believed that piece of evidence was permanently destroyed underwater.
Huge.
Shock. Huge. Second, they threatened total exposure. They detailed the imminent arrival of a massive FBI team the very next day. They told him the property would be crawling all over with federal agents, ensuring every single inch would be scoured. The implication was clear. If he didn't confess now, they were going to find the body anyway.
And then came the moment they used that digital roadmap against him, speaking directly to the phone data.
They went right for the facts he couldn't dispute, but also couldn't understand. They directly accused him of lying about Dylan being on the property and lying about the phone. They told him flat out, "You threw that phone in the pond."
The key was how they framed the evidence.
It was. They looked him in the eye and said, "We know you took that phone because we can see the phone follow your entire path to Lucin Pond. Every step you took, your phone recorded it, and Dylan's phone recorded it too."
For someone who admitted to barely understanding modern tech, hearing that his unseen movements were mapped and tracked, it must have been utterly disorienting.
It had to be paralyzing. He had relied on old-school deception, telling lies, hiding a gun, dumping an item in water. He never accounted for the permanence of the digital trace.
And the detectives just kept pressuring him, emphasizing that the data was a complete, irrefutable map of his movements from 2:37 p.m. to 2:52 p.m. It was incontrovertible physical evidence translated into digital certainty.
That pressure cooker atmosphere led to his final, abrupt breaking point.
The realization that his carefully constructed alibi had been entirely exposed by invisible tracking data, it finally shattered his composure. His defiance just crumbled. He didn't confess, not in words, but his immediate reaction was the ultimate admission of guilt. He demanded to end the confrontation and seek legal protection. He just abruptly stated, "I'd like to go home," or "I'd like to get a lawyer," or something.
The moment the digital facts met his denial, the conversation was over, and the police knew they had him.
And although James refused to speak any further, the investigators had one final, shocking piece of evidence waiting for them, right on Dylan's recovered phone. The phone didn't just contain location data, it contained a recording.
An actual video or audio recording.
A video recording. It was likely taken accidentally in the moments immediately preceding or during the attack. And the recording showed James Brenner himself wearing a camouflage t-shirt, actively wiping off a revolver pistol.
The same type of handgun he later tried to hide by giving it to Donald Hatley.
The very same. This recording provided the visual confirmation that linked Brenner directly to the weapon. But there was one more crucial detail visible on that video.
What was it?
The visual capture showed a red substance. It was visible on James's left elbow, his wrist, and his hand, all while he was cleaning the gun. Investigators later got a warrant for that camouflage t-shirt, and forensic tests confirmed that the red substance was, in fact, Dylan's DNA.
That video just closes the entire loop. It provides the motive, the weapon, the cleanup attempt, and the victim's physical presence, all tied directly to the suspect.
With the DNA on the boots, the GPS synchronization, and now this visual evidence of the cleanup, the charging decision was swift and certain. James Brenner was charged with first-degree felony, aggravated murder, abuse or desecration of a dead human body, and obstruction of justice.
The mountain of evidence was just insurmountable.
Completely. Faced with a near-certain conviction at trial, James opted to take a plea deal, hoping for a lighter sentence.
And that pre-deal finally brought some measure of closure to the grieving family, because it required James to lead investigators to the location of Dylan's remains.
As part of the agreement, he led them to the Lucin area, where Dylan's remains were finally recovered. The medical examiner's report provided the horrific final detail. Dylan had suffered 2 fatal bullet holes to his skull.
Which confirmed it was a brutal, lethal act. It was an execution, not a spontaneous fight that got out of control.
Exactly. It was carried out with the firearm Brenner had tried so hard to conceal. Ultimately, James Brenner pled guilty and was sentenced to 1 to 15 years in prison for the murder of Dylan Rounds. A truly devastating end to a life that was just beginning.
This deep dive, it really forces you to appreciate the complexity of modern investigations. The team didn't rely on just one single piece of evidence. They built this 3-pronged chain of proof.
They did. You have the physical proof Brenner's DNA on the bloodstained boots. You have the psychological profile, his history of aggravated assault and that deep resentment. And then you have the absolute unassailable proof of the digital trace, the synchronized GPS tracking.
Think about the immense power of that digital map. Brenner was so careful to construct a verbal alibi. He thought if he just drove away and went to a friend's house, he was safe. He thought throwing the phone in a submerged pipe was enough to destroy the evidence.
He never realized that by simply carrying Dylan's phone in his pocket for that 5-mile trip to the pond, he was drawing an undeniable, time-stamped route for the police to follow. His deception was meticulously mapped out for them.
And what stands out to me is the sheer chilling ease with which he carried on, acting perfectly normal, eating ribs just hours after the murder, smiling next to the family. He maintained this facade of innocence right up until the point the detectives confronted him, not just with an accusation, but with the data.
It was the concrete, objective evidence from the phone, something he couldn't argue with or lie his way out of, that finally broke him.
This case brings us back to that question we posed earlier, the nature of latent violence. Was this truly uncharacteristic, as the detective initially suggested to him? Or was it simply a predictable, if extreme, culmination of a known pattern?
I think we have to consider that this kind of violence often isn't a sudden explosion in a vacuum. It is a suppressed behavior. It's fueled by deep-seated resentment and a history of unresolved rage, as evidenced by that prior aggravated assault warrant.
So the lesson here is that even the most mundane provocation, parking a truck in the wrong spot, a perceived slight, can instantly turn lethal when the perpetrator already views himself as the judge and executioner of discipline.
The digital age didn't solve the problem of human rage, but in this case, it ensured the killer couldn't escape the responsibility for it.
The ultimate takeaway for you, the listener, is this. In a world where technology tracks our every movement, you might be able to lie to the people around you, but you can no longer lie to your devices. That data trail is permanent, and in the hands of meticulous investigators, it becomes the silent, undeniable witness to the truth.
It's a powerful realization about modern accountability, for sure.
That is the deep dive for today. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.